Hello and welcome to this mini lecture on the psychology of abuse. My name's Faye Short and I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at Bangor University. And during this lecture today, I'm going to explore the psychology of abuse to try to give you a better insight into what happens in any type of abusive relationship. And this is generalizable across a range of different types of abuse. So whether that's an abusive interpersonal relationship, like a spousal relationship or a friendship, whether it's child abuse, or even things like modern slavery. I've delivered this training in a whole range of places. I've delivered it to professionals in Childline to look at how child abuse can be explained. I've delivered it to senior crime investigators nationally to explain how modern slavery might be occurring from a psychological perspective. And so today I would like to give you an insight into the psychology of the abuser and the abused. While I'm going to talk about those two as separate entities, I do also just want to take a second to stress that they're not mutually exclusive. Somebody can, of course, be abusive towards another person while also being abused by someone else. So you might have a child who is being abused by a parent at home who then goes into the school environment and abuses another child. Or you may have somebody who is in a modern slavery hierarchical relationship where they are perhaps being abused by someone senior to them who is holding them as a slave and is putting them in that position, and they don't have any freedom and they're not able to exist freely. And so they are being abused, but then they are also involved in the recruitment of other people to move into this slavery ring. And so they are abusing others. So it's important to recognize, although I'm going to explain this as two separate things, the two may actually be very intertwined. So let's now start by getting an insight into the psychology of abuse. And we're going to begin by thinking about the person who abuses others. In order to better understand the mind of a person who abuses another person, we're going to consider four psychological phenomena. We're going to think about reinforcing and punishing consequences, diffusion of responsibility, principles, and freedom. So let's take each of these in turn. Social psychology research has found that we're less likely to help others if we're surrounded by more people, so if we're in a crowd. And we're more likely to behave badly if we're with other people who are also behaving badly. This is because we can diffuse responsibility for the actions amongst everyone present. So we don't feel personally responsible for not helping that old lady who fell down because, look, there's lots of other people on the street who aren't helping too. And we don't feel personally responsible for picking on this little boy in the playground because, look, all of my mates are doing it too. So we don't feel that sense of personal responsibility. An individual who is abusing another person can diffuse responsibility then to avoid experiencing empathy for what the other person is going through. So they might diffuse responsibility to other abusive people, such as diffusing it to their boss if they're in a modern slavery setup. I'm only following orders. To other criminals in a paedophile ring. I wasn't the only one, everyone was doing it. They might diffuse responsibility to the victim, thinking, it's not my fault, the so-called victim was asking for it. This is classic victim blaming. They might even diffuse responsibility to their own past, their parents, their medical history. My illness made me do it. It was because of my addiction. What do you expect with my childhood? I'm certainly not suggesting that these things, your medical history, your upbringing, I'm not suggesting those things don't have an impact. And we certainly need to consider those factors to help people. But diffusion of personal responsibility like this makes it easier for the abuser to ignore their own feelings of empathy while they are hurting the other person. Cognitive psychology research suggests that we try to find explanations for our own actions, and we may find it easier to overcome our natural sense of empathy and avoid feeling guilty about hurting another person if we can genuinely believe that we are acting on a moral, ethical, or social principle. Think about soldiers going into war and how the belief that they are fighting for the good of their country enables them to kill others. So let's apply this in an abusive situation. Let's consider the abusive partner who thinks they'd end up with someone worse if they left. At least I don't. The child abuser who thinks, this is survival of the fittest, I'm just toughening them up. The modern slaver who thinks, someone else would do it if I didn't. If I stopped doing this, someone else would just take my place and maybe they'd be worse to them. The bully who thinks, they'd do the same to me. If they were the popular one and they were the one with all the mates, they'd be treating me in the same way. These moral, ethical and social principles, these internal justifications for actions, enable the person to explain their behaviour in a way that puts themselves in a more positive light. Behavioural psychology research suggests that we have been conditioned to behave the way that we do today through reinforcement and punishment throughout our lives. This means that someone who is behaving in an abusive way to someone else must have previously been rewarded for being abusive or punished for not behaving abusively. So let's consider some of the positive consequences of being abusive. Things like gaining respect, getting the person to do what you want. Now, when I talk about respect there, I don't necessarily mean respect in the way that we might consider it to be, but respect in the sense that the person is frightened of them and treats them in what they perceive to be a respectful way. And let's consider some of the negative consequences of not being abusive. If I'm not frightening this person into doing what I want them to do, they might stop doing what I want them to do. They might leave me. My wife might leave me if I don't continue to intimidate her. If she's not too frightened to leave, she might not stay. It's really difficult to think in terms of the benefits of being abusive, but we have to understand these positive and negative consequences if we're going to put any kinds of interventions in place to help people stop being abusive to others. Let us now consider one of these potential positive consequences of being abusive. And this is perhaps the most distasteful and controversial of the four phenomena that we're considering in relation to abusers today. There's a fascinating debate in psychology about whether human beings are inherently good or bad, and indeed, what it even means to be good or bad. I'm not about to get into that debate here, but what we do know from research in social psychology is that people who are in a situation where there are no social controls to prevent them from behaving in ways that hurt others do often seem to indulge their darker side. Consider the kinds of abuses that have taken place in prisoner of war camps, in prisons, in fact, in any institutional setting that didn't have proper surveillance and punishment for abuse. So if an abuser feels that they have complete control over another person to the extent that they don't believe that they will be punished for hurting them because they don't think they're going to get caught, and if they have a principle in place, so they believe that for some reason they're doing the right thing or that they're doing something that isn't as bad as it might be perceived to be by somebody else, so if they can downplay the impact that they're having, and if they can diffuse responsibility to reduce their natural empathy, so those other two factors that we've just talked about, then they may be in a position to indulge their darker side and gain that sense of power and control that comes from hurting others. We've now considered the psychology of the individual who is abusing the other person. So let's now flip to consider the psychology of the person who is being abused. And while we consider the abuse from this other angle, I want you to hold in mind the abuser and the four phenomena we've talked about in relation to the abuser throughout. I want you to consider how the mind of the abuser feeds into and maintains the mind of the person being abused, and vice versa. So how those two things interlink together. Before I begin talking about the mind of the abused, I'd like to explain why I deliberately chose the word abused rather than victim or survivor. First of all, survivor implies that the abuse is over, but actually it may be continuing for some people. So I don't want to give the impression that this is psychology of somebody who has been through abuse and come out the other side. It also implies that the person has survived, and some people may not survive abuse. Some people, sadly, may take their own life as a result of the abuse, or they may be in a position where they're killed by their abuser. So survivor is not quite the right word that we're looking for here. Similarly, victim has certain connotations, such as victim blaming, and it really objectifies the person as being nothing more than someone who's having something done to them. The abused is not perfect, and I prefer not to use it as a noun, but instead to focus on it as an experience. So rather than labeling somebody as the abused, I'd like to use it in terms of the person who is being abused, so that we're focusing on the person first. So to understand the mind of the person who is being abused, we're going to cover 4 key psychological phenomena. We're going to think about threat to survival perception, no escape perception, small kindness perception, and isolation from other perspectives. You'll notice there we have 3 perceptions and 1 isolation. Let's consider them in turn. Threat to survival perception means that the person genuinely believes that the abuser might kill them, or kill someone they love, or even that the abuser might kill themselves. This belief could come from a direct threat. She threatened to kill my kids if I left. Or an implied threat. He told me what he'd done to Claire when she tried to escape. Or even, he punched a hole right through the wall. That just shows what a temper he has and what he could do to me if he lost his temper. Remember, this is a perception. It doesn't matter whether the abuser is genuinely likely to kill someone. All that matters to create this fear is the belief that they will. If that belief is instilled in the person being abused, then we have one of these 4 factors for the mindset of the individual being abused. The no escape perception means that the person being abused genuinely believes that they cannot escape from this situation. Remember, again, this is a perception. It doesn't matter whether in reality they could escape. It is the perception that is key here. They might believe this because of the threats. So they've been threatened that if they try to leave, they'll be killed or somebody else will be killed. Or they might believe that there's no escape because they believe that they couldn't survive on their own, or that they deserve this treatment, or that they are morally, socially, or ethically obliged to stay. For example, they believe that they chose to marry this person and now they're obliged to stay in the marriage. Now remember the psychology of the abuser and how they will find a principle. That principle could now feed into the psychology of the person being abused. She was asking for it. It's my fault that he did this. He couldn't survive without me. I'm too weak to be alone. These kinds of thoughts in the person being abused can create a sense of inevitability that means that that person believes that there is genuinely no escape. The small kindness perception is perhaps one of the cruelest of the abuse factors. Human beings are remarkably resilient, and they will find hope in even the most desperate of situations. Think about people who retained hope through the concentration camps in the Second World War. In the face of a threat to life with no possibility of escape, the only hope remaining is that the abuser will eventually stop hurting you. So the person being abused will actively seek evidence to support that hope. For example, she's a good person underneath. This is just because of the drink. Any small kindness is now perceived as evidence to support that hope. She took me out for dinner after she hit me. He said sorry and I know he meant it. Eventually, even something like the abuser not being as abusive as previously can be interpreted as a small kindness. I spilt her coffee and she didn't even hit me. The previous 3 factors were all perceptions. It doesn't matter whether they were factual or not. All that matters is that the person believes them to be true. And one of the key ways that these perceptions can be fostered is if the person is isolated from other perspectives that might help them to question these beliefs. Isolation can be due to direct orders from the abuser. For example, someone actually telling their partner, you are not allowed to see your friends. More often, though, it's more implicit. For example, a fight always happens after she visits her family, so she eventually chooses to stop seeing them because it's not worth the argument afterwards. In this way, the individual being abused actually begins to isolate themselves. And this is also why we can't just argue against these perceptions when we're working with someone who is being abused. If every time they meet us, we start attacking their beliefs, then they're not going to want to spend time with us, and they might actively start avoiding us and become even more isolated. So we've now considered the 4 factors relating to the psychology of the abused, and I know that there will now be one question in your mind. Okay, now I understand, how can I help? Well, there's no easy answer to that. If there was, abuse just wouldn't happen anymore. But you're actually helping right now. By better understanding the psychology behind abuse, then we're better equipped to help those suffering from abuse. It's important to recognise that when we're giving these explanations for why abuse happens and how abuse happens, they are not excuses. They are actually critical for being able to understand and eventually stop abuse from happening. Understanding the mind of the abuser means that we can then begin rehabilitating people who engage in abusive actions. And understanding the mind of the person who is being abused means that we may be able to intervene and help them to escape the abusive situation and set off on their journey of life in a more positive direction. I hope that this talk has given you a deeper insight into the psychology of abuse and a better understanding of people who abuse others and people who are being abused. Thank you so much for engaging with this mini lecture.